Sign here, Mom. It's for your own good. Daniel's voice was calm, practiced, the same tone he used when explaining things to clients. Not to me, not to the woman who had raised him. And I remember looking down at the paper in front of me, the lines of legal language swimming just slightly out of focus, not because I couldn't read them, but because I suddenly understood exactly what they thought of me, and for a moment I said nothing. I simply folded my hands in my lap and let the silence stretch, the way my late husband used to do, when he knew someone had just made a mistake they couldn't undo. And across the table Lisa shifted in her chair, her smile still perfectly in place but tighter now, like she was waiting for me to nod, to comply, to become the version of me they had already decided I was. And I almost smiled back, because 2 weeks earlier none of this had been said out loud. Not like this, not so cleanly. But the signs had been there if I was willing to see them. Small things at first, the kind you brush off. Because you trust your own family. Because you believe love doesn't come with conditions. I remember standing in my kitchen that morning, sunlight coming through the blinds in thin, quiet lines, making coffee the way I always did, one scoop too many because I liked it strong, and my phone buzzed with a notification from my bank, something about unusual activity, and I frowned, thinking it was a mistake, because I hadn't used my card anywhere unusual, not in this quiet little town where I'd lived for over 40 years, where every cashier knew my name, where every receipt was predictable, and when I tried to log into my account, the password didn't work, not once, not twice, and I told myself I must have typed it wrong, that maybe I'd forgotten, because that's what people start to believe when the world gently suggests they're getting older, that maybe their memory isn't what it used to be, that maybe they need help. And later that afternoon Daniel stopped by unannounced, which he rarely did, and Lisa followed just a step behind him, her heels clicking softly against my hardwood floors, her eyes scanning the room in that quiet, measuring way she had, like she was always taking inventory of something that didn't belong to her yet. And they sat me down at this very table, the same one my husband and I had picked out 32 years ago, solid oak, built to last, just like we thought our family would be, and Daniel cleared his throat before he spoke, avoiding my eyes for just a second too long, and he said, "Mom, we've been thinking," and I knew right then that whatever came next wasn't going to be a suggestion, it was going to be a decision they had already made, and Lisa reached over, placing her hand lightly on his arm, guiding him, steadying him, as if he needed permission to say what he was about to say. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't about concern, it wasn't about helping me, it was about control, quiet, polite, carefully packaged control, and I remember nodding slowly, encouraging him to continue, because I wanted to hear every word. I wanted them to believe I didn't see it coming, that I was exactly who they thought I was, and now here I was, 2 weeks later, staring at a document that would hand over everything I had built, everything my husband and I had worked for, to the very people who had decided I was no longer capable of holding it. And I finally lifted my eyes from the paper to look at my son, really look at him, at the man he had become, and then at the woman beside him, the one who had been whispering in the spaces between our conversations for years, and I let out a soft breath. Calm, measured, controlled, and I said nothing at all, because sometimes silence is the only answer that matters, and sometimes it's the first move in a game they don't even realize has already begun. I did not sign the paper that day, not because I needed more time to understand it, but because I already understood it too well, and instead I placed my glasses back on the table and looked at Daniel with a softness that I knew would disarm him, the same softness I used when he was a boy trying to explain why he had broken something he should not have touched, and I said, "Let me think about it." And Lisa smiled immediately, relieved, as if she had just secured something that was already hers, and Daniel nodded, grateful for the lack of resistance. And that was the moment they made their second mistake, because they believed my silence meant surrender, and after they left I sat alone at the table for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the house, the refrigerator in the kitchen, the clock on the wall, the familiar sounds that had never once made me feel small, and yet suddenly everything felt different. Not empty, but observed, as if my life had become something they were already rearranging in their minds. And the next morning, I went to the bank in person, something I had not needed to do in years, and the young teller greeted me with a polite smile that faded just slightly when she saw my account, and I noticed it, that flicker of hesitation, that careful shift in tone, and I said nothing at first. I simply asked her to print my recent transactions, and when the paper slid across the counter toward me, I felt a stillness settle inside my chest. Not panic, not anger, just clarity. Because there were transfers I did not recognize, neat, regular amounts moving into an account I had never authorized, and I traced one line with my finger, then another, each one like a quiet confirmation of what I had already begun to suspect, and I thanked her, folded the paper carefully, and walked out into the parking lot where the air felt cooler than it should have for that time of year, and I sat in my car without starting the engine, reading every line again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to remember exactly how it felt in that moment. The moment when doubt turned into certainty, and later that afternoon Daniel called, his voice light, casual, asking if I had a chance to think about everything. And I could hear Lisa in the background, not speaking, just present, always present. And I told him I was still considering it, that I appreciated his concern, and he sounded relieved again. And I realized then that they were not watching me closely, not yet. They were waiting for me to fall into place, to follow the version of the story they had already written, and that gave me something I had not expected, time. And that evening I took out the old leather folder my husband had kept in his study, the one he always said was for important things, and inside were documents I had not looked at in years, neatly organized. Everything from property deeds to account records to the name of the attorney we had trusted for decades, and I ran my hand over the pages slowly, remembering the way he used to sit at this same table, reviewing everything with quiet patience, never rushing, never assuming, and I heard his voice in my mind as clearly as if he were standing behind me, reminding me that control is not something you give away, not even to family, especially not to family. And for the first time since Daniel had placed that paper in front of me, I allowed myself a small, private smile, because they thought they were protecting me from something I could no longer handle. But what they had really done was show me exactly where to look, and exactly how far they were willing to go. And now that I could see it clearly, I knew one thing for certain. I was not going to stop them by arguing. I was not going to stop them by refusing. I was going to stop them by letting them believe they had already won. The next time they came over, I made sure the house looked exactly the way they expected it to, quiet, predictable, unchanged, the curtains drawn just enough to soften the afternoon light. The same porcelain dishes set neatly on the table, the same framed photographs lining the walls, each one a reminder of a life they seemed to think I had already outgrown. And when Daniel stepped inside, he glanced around quickly, not with appreciation but with assessment, as if he were measuring how much longer everything would remain under my control, and Lisa followed behind him, her smile warm, practiced, carrying a store-bought pie she placed carefully on the counter as if it were a gesture of kindness rather than strategy, and I welcomed them both with the same gentle tone I had always used, offering coffee, asking about their week, letting the conversation drift through safe, harmless topics while I watched the spaces between their words, the quick glances they exchanged, the subtle way Lisa guided the direction of every question, and it did not take long before the conversation circled back to what they really wanted, because it always does, and Daniel cleared his throat again, that same nervous habit, and he said, "Mom, we just want to make sure everything is taken care of," and I nodded slowly, as if I had been thinking about nothing else, and I told him I had been reviewing my finances, that things were getting harder to keep track of, and I let my voice soften just enough to suggest uncertainty. And I saw it immediately, the shift in Lisa's posture, the satisfaction she tried to hide, the way her fingers relaxed slightly around her coffee cup, and Daniel leaned forward, encouraged now, explaining how complicated things could become, how easy it was to make mistakes, how they only wanted to help me avoid problems in the future, and I listened carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, just allowing him to build the version of me that made his actions feel justified. And when he finished, I reached for the paper they had brought again, the same document, the same carefully prepared lines, and I held it in my hands for a moment before looking up at him with a small, almost uncertain smile, and I said, "You are probably right." And the relief on his face was immediate, almost childlike, as if he had been waiting for approval rather than taking control, and Lisa's eyes flickered with something sharper, something more calculating, and she leaned slightly closer, her voice gentle but precise as she pointed to where I should sign, guiding me step by step. as if I needed direction, as if I could not see the lines on my own, and I followed her finger with my eyes, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them lean in, just long enough to make them believe they were witnessing the moment everything shifted in their favor. And then I placed the pen down without signing, slowly, deliberately. And I looked at Daniel again, really looked at him, and I asked a simple question: when did you start moving money out of my accounts? And the room changed instantly, not loudly, not dramatically, but in that quiet, unmistakable way that happens when truth enters a space that was built on something else. And Daniel blinked, caught off guard, his mouth opening slightly before closing again, and Lisa straightened in her chair, her expression tightening just for a second before she smoothed it over. And I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply reached into the drawer beside me and placed the printed bank statements on the table between us, each page aligned neatly, each number clear, undeniable, and I watched as Daniel's eyes moved across the lines, recognition settling in slowly, heavily, and Lisa spoke first. Of course she did, her tone calm, controlled, explaining that there must have been a misunderstanding, that perhaps the accounts had been reorganized for convenience, that everything was being handled responsibly. And I nodded again, as if I were considering her explanation, as if I needed time to understand it, and I folded my hands once more, resting them lightly on the table, and I said, "Of course, that makes sense." And I saw the confusion flicker across Daniel's face, because he had expected resistance, or anger, or tears, something he could respond to, something that would confirm the role they had assigned me. But I gave him none of that, only calm, only patience, only the quiet certainty of someone who was no longer trying to prove anything at all. And in that moment I knew they still did not understand. They still believed this was a conversation they could manage, a situation they could control, and that was exactly where I needed them to be. They left that afternoon sooner than they had planned, and although Lisa tried to maintain her composure, I could see the tension in the way she gathered her purse, in the way her smile no longer reached her eyes, and Daniel lingered for just a moment longer at the doorway, as if he wanted to say something, to explain, or perhaps to justify, but no words came, and I did not offer him any. I simply stood there with my hand resting lightly against the frame, watching as he walked down the driveway. Beside her, their voices low, urgent, blending into the quiet of the late afternoon, and when the door closed behind them the house returned to its natural stillness, a stillness that no longer felt empty but clear, like the air after a storm that has not yet fully arrived. And I moved slowly back to the table, gathering the papers they had left behind, smoothing them out one by one, not with frustration, not with anger, but with a kind of careful attention that I had learned over a lifetime. Because this was not the first time I had seen something valuable being quietly taken apart under the appearance of concern, and as I sat there I found myself thinking back to the early years of my marriage, to the small apartment Daniel grew up in, to the nights when his father and I would sit at a narrow kitchen table, balancing bills and plans, deciding what we could afford and what we had to wait for, every dollar accounted for, every decision shared, and I remembered how hard we had worked to build something stable, something lasting, not just for ourselves but for him, for the future we believed he would grow into. And I remembered the day we bought this house, how Daniel had run through the empty rooms laughing, his voice echoing off the bare walls, calling out which room would be his, and how his father had stood beside me, his hand resting quietly on my shoulder, telling me that everything we had done had led to that moment, to that sense of security, of ownership, of control over our own lives. And now, sitting in that same house decades later, I realized how easily that sense of control could be misunderstood by those who had never had to fight for it, how easily it could be mistaken for something that could simply be transferred, reassigned, managed by someone else. And I stood up slowly and walked into his study, the room I had kept almost exactly the same since he passed, not out of sadness, but out of respect. And I opened the drawer where he kept his correspondence, pulling out the business card I had seen just the night before, the name printed in clean, simple letters, Howard Klein, the attorney who had handled everything for us for years, and I held it in my hand for a moment, feeling the weight of what it represented, not just legal knowledge, but history, trust, a record of decisions made carefully and deliberately. And I picked up the phone and dialed the number without hesitation, And when his assistant answered, I introduced myself, my voice steady, my tone calm, explaining that I needed to schedule a meeting, something private, something soon. And there was a brief pause on the other end before she recognized my name, before her voice shifted into something warmer, more attentive, and she assured me he would make time, that he would want to see me, and I thanked her and hung up, placing the phone back on the desk with the same quiet precision I had used all day. And as I stood there, I looked around the room once more, at the shelves lined with files, at the chair where my husband used to sit reviewing everything with patience and clarity, and I realized that nothing they had done had actually taken anything from me yet. Not really. Because control is not something that disappears overnight. It is something you either hold on to or you choose to let go. And I had not let go. Not then, not now. And as the evening light began to fade through the window, I allowed myself another small, private smile, because they believed they had already begun to reshape my life. But what they had really done was remind me exactly how it had been built in the first place, and that meant I knew exactly how to protect it. The meeting with Howard Klein was scheduled for the following morning, and I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I was unsure, but because I had always believed that time, like money, should be handled with intention. And as I sat in the quiet reception area, I noticed how little had changed over the years. The same muted tones on the walls, the same neatly arranged magazines no one ever seemed to read, the same sense of order that comes from people who understand the value of precision. And when his assistant greeted me, she did so with a warmth that felt genuine, not practiced, and she led me into his office where he stood to meet me. Older now, of course, but still carrying that same steady presence I remembered, the kind that does not rush, does not assume. And after a brief exchange of polite words, he gestured for me to sit, his eyes already attentive, already searching for what had brought me there. And I did not waste time with explanations that were not necessary. I simply placed the bank statements on his desk, followed by the unsigned document Daniel had brought, and I watched as he read through them carefully, line by line, his expression changing not dramatically, but enough for me to recognize that he understood the situation completely. And when he finally looked up at me, there was no confusion in his gaze, only clarity, and he asked a single question: "Did you authorize any of these transfers?" And I answered just as simply, "No." And he nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he had already concluded, and then he leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together as he explained what had been done, not in emotional terms, not in accusations, but in facts, clear and structured, that the access to my accounts suggested a level of control that should never have been granted without full understanding, that the document they wanted me to sign would formalize that control completely, giving them legal authority to manage, move, and potentially liquidate assets without requiring further consent. And I listened without interruption, not because I was surprised, but because hearing it stated so plainly removed any remaining doubt. And he paused then, studying my expression, perhaps expecting some sign of distress, but I gave him none, only a calm nod, and I asked him what my options were, and he answered with the same measured tone, explaining that there were immediate steps we could take, accounts that could be secured, permissions that could be revoked, and more importantly, that there were ways to document what had already occurred, to create a clear record that would protect me moving forward. And I felt something settle into place as he spoke, not relief, not exactly, but alignment, as if everything I had sensed over the past 2 weeks was now being confirmed in a language that could not be ignored. And when he finished, I thanked him, not out of politeness, but because I understood the value of having someone who dealt in facts rather than feelings. And before I left, he asked if I wanted him to contact Daniel directly, to address the situation formally, and I shook my head, just once, because that was not how this would unfold, not yet. And I told him I would prefer to handle things personally for the time being, that I would follow his guidance on securing what needed to be secured, but that I wanted to give them the opportunity to continue exactly as they had been. And he studied me for a moment longer, perhaps recognizing something in my tone, something deliberate, and then he nodded in understanding, because some things do not need to be explained when both people know exactly what is being said without words. And when I stepped back outside, the air felt different again, not colder this time, but clearer. And as I walked to my car, I realized that nothing about this situation was uncertain anymore, not their intentions, not my position, not the outcome that was slowly taking shape. And for the first time since Daniel had placed that paper in front of me, I was no longer reacting to what they were doing. I was preparing for what I would do next. When I returned home that afternoon, I did not rush. I did not check anything immediately. I simply set my keys down in the same place I always had and walked through the house slowly, room by room, as if I were seeing it not for the first time, but with a clarity I had not allowed myself before, and everything felt steady, unchanged, which was exactly why it was so important to protect it. And later that evening Daniel called again, his timing almost predictable now, his voice carrying that same careful balance between concern and expectation. And he asked if I had made a decision about the document, and I let a small pause settle between us before answering, just enough to make him lean into the silence. And I told him I thought it would be best if we went over everything together once more, that I wanted to be sure I understood all the details, and I could hear the relief in his voice. The way his words came a little quicker, a little lighter, and he agreed immediately, suggesting we meet again the next day. And in the background I heard Lisa's voice, low but present, asking something I could not quite make out. And he responded to her before returning to me, confirming the time, confirming the plan, and I agreed with the same calm tone I had used all along, never once pushing, never once resisting. And when the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and allowed myself a moment to stand therein. The quiet, because everything was moving exactly as it needed to. And the next morning I followed Howard's instructions carefully, step by step, contacting the bank to secure my accounts, changing access permissions, placing quiet safeguards that would not alert anyone immediately, but would prevent further movement without my approval, and each action felt deliberate, controlled, like restoring the proper order of something that had been subtly disturbed. And by the time Daniel and Lisa arrived, later that afternoon, nothing about the house suggested anything had changed, and that was important, because what they saw needed to match what they believed, and I greeted them with the same warmth, the same gentle smile, inviting them to sit, offering coffee, allowing the routine to settle in before the real conversation began. And Lisa did not waste time. She placed the document on the table again, turning it slightly toward me, her finger resting near the signature line as if guiding a process that was already decided. And Daniel watched me closely this time, more carefully than before, as if he sensed something had shifted but could not yet identify what. And I picked up the pen, holding it lightly between my fingers, letting the moment stretch just long enough to draw their full attention. And then I looked up at them both, my expression calm, almost thoughtful, and I said, "Before I sign anything, I want to make sure everything is exactly as it should be." And Lisa nodded, quickly, reassuring, confident, explaining again how the document would simplify everything, how it would make things easier for me, how it was simply a precaution. And I listened, letting her speak, letting her build the same careful narrative. And when she finished, I placed the pen back down on the table once more, slowly, deliberately, and I said, "That sounds reasonable." And I saw the tension ease from Daniel's shoulders, saw the faint satisfaction return to Lisa's eyes, and in that moment, I knew they were still exactly where I needed them to be, still believing this was a matter of patience, of persuasion, of guiding me toward a decision I did not fully understand. And I folded my hands again, resting them calmly in front of me, and I added, "Let us go through everything one last time tomorrow, with all the details, just to be certain." And neither of them objected, because to them it sounded like hesitation, like uncertainty, like the final step before agreement. And as they nodded, as they reassured me once more that everything was under control, I realized that control had already returned to exactly where it belonged. They just had not recognized it yet. The next morning arrived with a quiet kind of certainty, the kind that does not rush or announce itself. And I woke early, not out of worry but out of habit, the same way I had for decades. And I moved through my routine with steady hands, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the soft light fill the room. And for a moment, everything looked exactly as it always had, calm, orderly, unchanged. And that was precisely what made the difference, because beneath that calm, everything had already shifted. And by the time Daniel and Lisa arrived later that day, I had already spoken to the bank again, confirmed every safeguard, every restriction, every quiet barrier that now stood between them and anything they believed they could access. And when the doorbell rang, I did not hurry. I let it ring once more before walking over, opening the door with the same gentle expression, the same warmth they expected, and they stepped inside carrying that familiar confidence, that quiet assumption that today would be the day everything was finalized, and Lisa's eyes moved quickly around the room again, always measuring, always calculating, while Daniel held the folder in his hand a little tighter than before, as if he needed the reassurance of something physical, something concrete, and I led them to the table without a word, offering coffee again, maintaining the rhythm, the normalcy that made everything feel safe to them. And when they sat down, Lisa immediately placed the document in front of me, smoother this time, more certain, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed on me, waiting, watching, and I could feel the weight of their expectations settle into the space between us, and I let it stay there for a moment, just long enough to make the silence noticeable, and then I reached for the pen, holding it lightly once more, letting my fingers rest against it without moving. And I looked down at the paper, then back up at them, my expression calm, almost thoughtful, and I said, before I sign this, I wanted to make sure everything we discussed is clear. And Lisa nodded quickly, ready, rehearsed, beginning to explain again how the document would allow them to manage things efficiently, how it would prevent complications, how it was simply a responsible step, and Daniel added a few words of agreement, his tone softer now, almost reassuring, and I listened to both of them without interruption, letting their voices fill the room, letting them build the same structure they had relied on from the beginning. And when they finished, I placed the pen down once more, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with quiet intention, and I folded my hands together, resting them on the table as I met Daniel's eyes, holding his gaze just long enough for him to feel it, and I said, I spoke with Mr. Klein this morning, and the change was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, Daniel's expression tightening slightly, his shoulders shifting, and Lisa's smile faltering for just a fraction of a second before she recovered, asking calmly what he had said, and I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply explained that I had reviewed everything carefully, that I now understood exactly what the document would allow, exactly what had already been done, and exactly what would happen if I signed it. And I watched as Daniel's confidence began to waver, as the certainty he had carried into the room started to slip. And Lisa leaned forward slightly, her tone still controlled but sharper now, suggesting that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding, that legal matters can sometimes be explained in ways that sound more complicated than they are, and I nodded slowly, as if considering her words, and then I reached beside me and placed a new set of documents on the table, neatly arranged, each page aligned with care, and I slid them toward them without urgency, without emphasis, and I said, these are the updated account authorizations, and Daniel looked down, confusion settling in. As he scanned the pages, and Lisa's eyes followed quickly, her expression tightening again as she realized what they meant, that access had been restricted, that permissions had been changed, that the quiet control they believed they had was no longer there, and I remained exactly as I had been from the beginning, calm, composed, my hands resting lightly in front of me, because nothing about this moment required force or volume, only clarity. And as they both looked back up at me, I could see it clearly now, not anger, not confrontation, but realization, the slow, undeniable understanding that the situation they thought they were managing had already moved beyond them. And for the first time since this had begun, neither of them spoke immediately, and in that silence, everything they had assumed about me quietly came undone. Daniel was the first to speak, but the words did not come as easily as they had before, his voice lower now, less certain, as he asked what exactly those changes meant, and I watched him carefully, not with judgment, not with anger, but with the same quiet attention I had given him when he was a child trying to understand something beyond him, and I explained simply that the accounts were now secure, that all unauthorized access had been removed, that any future decisions regarding my finances would require my direct approval, and nothing more, and I saw the realization begin to settle deeper into his expression. The slow recognition that what he had assumed was already within his control had never truly been his to begin with. And Lisa leaned forward then, her composure still intact but strained now at the edges, her voice steady but sharper as she said there must have been some confusion, that everything they had done had been in my best interest, that they were only trying to help. And I nodded once, acknowledging her words without accepting them, because I understood something she did not, that intentions are often presented in ways that sound kind, but actions reveal something far more precise, and I reached for the bank statements once more, placing them gently beside the new documents, aligning them carefully as I had done before, and I said, "Help does not require secrecy," and the room fell quiet again, not with tension, but with clarity, the kind that leaves no space for misunderstanding. And Daniel looked down at the papers again, his shoulders slightly lowered now, his posture no longer forward, no longer assertive, and for a moment I saw something familiar in his expression, not the man who had walked into my house expecting control, but the boy who had once looked to me for direction, for guidance, for understanding, and I felt a brief, quiet sadness pass through me, not because of what had been done, but because of what had been lost along the way. And Lisa shifted in her seat, her confidence recalibrating, her tone softening again as she suggested that perhaps they had moved too quickly, that perhaps they should revisit everything together, take a step back, approach it differently, and I listened, allowing her to adjust the narrative, to reshape it into something more acceptable, more reasonable, and when she finished I folded my hands once more and said, "That would be wise," and I saw the flicker of relief return, small but immediate, as if she believed the situation was returning to something manageable, something they could still influence, and I let that belief remain. I did not challenge it. I did not correct it, because it no longer mattered, and Daniel looked up at me then, his voice quieter as he said, "We just wanted to make sure you were taken care of," and I held his gaze for a moment, steady, calm, and I replied, "I have always taken care of myself," and there was no accusation in my voice, no edge, only a simple statement of fact, and he nodded slowly, as if hearing something he had forgotten, something he had not considered, and the conversation did not escalate. It did not become loud or confrontational. It simply settled into a different shape, one where the roles they had assumed no longer fit, and after a few more words, a few more careful exchanges, they stood to leave, not abruptly, but without the same confidence they had arrived with. And as I walked them to the door, I noticed the difference in their steps, in the space between them, in the silence that now followed instead of guided. And when the door closed behind them, I stood there for a moment longer, my hand resting lightly against the wood, feeling the quiet return once again. But this time it felt complete, resolved in a way that had not been there before. And I turned back toward the house, toward the life I had built, knowing that nothing had been taken from me, not truly, because I had never handed it over, and now, neither of them would ever mistake that again. The house felt quieter in the days that followed, not in a way that suggested absence, but in a way that reflected clarity, as if something that had been quietly unsettled had finally been placed back where it belonged, and I moved through my routine with the same steady rhythm I had always known, making breakfast, watering the plants by the window, checking the mail at the end of the driveway, each small action grounding me in the life I had built long before anyone thought they could redefine it. And Daniel called again 2 days later, his voice more careful now, less certain of how he would be received, and I answered without hesitation, without delay, because there was nothing left to avoid, and he asked how I was doing. A simple question, but this time it carried something different, something closer to sincerity than obligation, and I told him I was well, and there was a pause on the line, not uncomfortable, but searching, as if he was trying to find the right words in a conversation that no longer followed the script he had expected, and eventually he said that he had been thinking about everything, that perhaps they had moved too quickly, that perhaps they should have talked more openly, and I listened, allowing him the space to reach that conclusion on his own, because understanding that is given too easily is rarely kept. And when he finished, I told him that trust is not something that can be managed for someone else. It is something that is either respected or it is not. And he did not argue. He did not defend. He simply acknowledged it in a quiet way. That felt closer to the boy I once knew than the man who had sat across from me with a document in his hand. And after we ended the call, I did not feel victorious. I did not feel the need to prove anything further, because this had never been about winning. It had been about remembering what I was capable of, remembering what I had built, remembering that control is not granted by others. It is held by those who understand its value. And later that week, I returned to Howard Klein's office to finalize a few remaining details. ensuring that every safeguard was properly documented, that every boundary was clear, not out of fear, but out of respect for the life I intended to continue living on my own terms. And as I left his office, I felt that same sense of quiet certainty settle in once more, not because everything had been resolved perfectly, but because everything was now exactly as it should be. And when I arrived home that evening, I paused for a moment at the doorway, looking out across the familiar stretch of lawn, the same view I had seen for decades, unchanged, steady. And I realized that nothing about my life had ever depended on someone else deciding what I could or could not handle. And as I stepped inside, I closed the door gently behind me, not as an act of finality, but as a simple acknowledgement that some things do not need to be explained, they only need to be understood. And I walked back into the house with the same calm, measured steps I had taken every day before, knowing that I had not only protected what was mine, but had also made something unmistakably clear to them and to myself. That age does not diminish clarity, it sharpens it, and that the quiet strength they had mistaken for weakness was the very thing that ensured I would never lose control of the life I had spent a lifetime building.